Hello there and welcome to the video. Today I am partnering with Daler-Rowney to show you the Daler-Rowney System3 heavy body acrylics. These are, as the name implies, quite thick, heavy acrylics. They have really high quality pigments, and because they have a really thick pigment load, you can thin them with water. So that's what I'm doing for the start of this. I'm just kind of thinning it out with water and using them as a more liquid acrylic in order to establish the sketch of this piece, which is going to be my kitty Muse. I love my cat. He's the best. I have two cats. Their names are Muse and Matcha, and I will not spend the entire video talking about my cats, but they're awesome, and I'm painting Muse. Muse is a great cat, but I am painting him blue because throughout this whole series with the Daler-Rowney System3 products, I have been painting my animals blue, so he is a blue cat today, which is funny because we think he is a Russian blue, so there you go. So that's how I started with thinning out those paints and pulling them in there, and then I started building up the overall kind of layers and locking in the shading where it was going to be. Also adding in a couple different varieties of blue tones, some more warm blues and some more cool blues to make certain parts pull forward and certain parts recede. I usually start my paintings like this in order to kind of get a sense of the overall structure of the painting. So this is kind of how I start everything, blocking out those overall shapes and colors without worrying too much about detail and things like that. These are a really heavy body texture, like I said, so it's great for impasto techniques and palette knife techniques, which we're going to play around with later. And that means that when you put the paint on there, it's really going to hold your brush strokes. It's really going to create hold the peaks of the paint, so you can really create these thick textured paint strokes on there, which I love. So I'm really excited to play around with that. Also, these do dry to this nice, neat eggshell finish, which I really like. It's kind of a nice mixture between shiny and matte. So it's got the shininess that retains the richness of those pigments and those colors. But because it's not too shiny, it's not like the sun is blinding you and you can't actually see any of the details. These are available in 27 different colors, all of which are consistent across the System3 line. And if you go over to the website, you can kind of see more information about the light fastness and the opaque or transparency of the actual paint. There's a whole guide online, so you can go and see which paints are going to be more opaque, which paints are going to be more transparent, which is really helpful for when you're planning out your painting and what your colors are going to look like. So for example, I knew that this lemon yellow is a transparent color, so I mixed it with the titanium white, which is an opaque color, and that was able to create a more opaque background as I put in this bright yellow color in that background area. So in terms of the information about the paints, that's kind of everything you need to know, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about the painting in the rest of this video. So as you can see, I'm building up the background, and that's because I am going to be painting everything else over the top of this background. So once I have those colors layered in and the whole painting set up the way that I want, I start to build up the opacity of this background so that you really can't see any patchiness or anything like that. So it's this nice, consistent, bright yellow. I loved this yellow. I thought it was a really pretty yellow, and I love how it looks against the blue colors that I chose for his fur. So I'm super happy with this. Also, I painted this on a wood panel for anyone curious. Paints are multi-surface paints, so you can use them on a variety of different surfaces, and also they are indoor and outdoor, so you can kind of use them on outdoor projects as well if you're doing that. So since they work really well with mixed media, I thought it would be really fun to do it on a wood panel because I really enjoy working on wood panels. They don't warp, and you don't have to worry about the canvas sinking in the middle like you might have to with stretched paintings. Also, they're a lot easier to mail for commissions and if people purchase them. I'm just a big fan of working on those wood panels, so this was great for that. Once I had that yellow background in, I went in with some leafy kind of shapes on these long stems, and I really wanted to build up some texture with these, so I mixed up quite a bit of green paint and really tried to lay it on thickly. So this is really fun. This is definitely a little out of my comfort zone because even though I love thick paint techniques, I don't often use them that much in my own art. So it's something that I don't have as much control over in terms of using palette knives and laying down paint. I don't always know instinctively how the paint is going to lay the way I do in other types of painting techniques where I've been doing them for a lot longer. So this was really fun to play around with that and kind of learn a little bit more about how thick paint works, how it flows or doesn't flow, for lack of a better term, and which way the paint is going to kind of move as you press your brush or your palette knife down. So I laid those in, started adding in some darker colors towards the center, just a darker green, just to add a little bit of shading to that. And then I also started adding some shading to these back leaves that are going to be behind him, just because we're working from back to front. So like I said, I lay the whole thing out at the beginning, but then when we add in the details, we work from back to front, so we don't have to worry about too much about painting around little details later with that background color. I also add in some little highlights to the tips of the flower in a brighter green, just made by mixing green in with some of that yellow color of the background. I'm going to mix in a lot of this yellow color into the greens and even into the blues a little bit, because that really will bring that yellow color into the painting and tie everything together. By using your background color in the painting, whether it's in highlights or in shadows, you can really tie it in and bring some good color harmony to your entire piece. I'm going to add some even brighter highlights just to the very tips of those leaves, just to really kind of blend them into the background, and also to get the idea of some light kind of coming a little bit behind them. And then I'm also adding some lightness to the shadows of those leaves down at the bottom. It's important to add shading to your shadows as well, and not just have shadows be one color, because there's usually highlights in your shadows. They're just not going to be as bright as the highlights that are in the lighter portions of the leaves. So I definitely want to remember that. And then I also start blending in and adding some little vein shapes on the leaves, just very subtly, so that they're just kind of hidden in there. Once I have the leaves done, it's finally time to start adding the details to my baby muse, and I'm using Princeton brushes for all of this. I'm a big fan of their angled brushes, their dagger brush, and also just the flat shaders. Those are the types of brushes that I'm going to be using through all of this. I believe right now I'm using an angled brush or a flat shader. It's a little hard for me to tell, but one of those two, because they work great for adding in those flat areas, but you can also turn them on their edge, and I can use them to get those little detailed strokes that are going to mimic fur. At this point, I'm both building in the texture of his fur and also refining the shading on his face so that everything looks the way that it should, so that his markings are in the correct area, and so that he has some three-dimensionality to him. I'm also going around and doing the detailing on the eyes, getting those eyeballs to sink into the face instead of being just floating on there, and adding in his pupils. Adding in the little details on his wee little nose and giving him a mouth. He's a very serious looking cat, so he looks very serious in the painting. And then just doing some final details on his muzzle as well, just to bring all of that together, and adding in some of those warmer blues that we talked about, so there's some variety of tones in his fur. Continuing to add in those little details by using the edge of the brush, I'm using a feathering motion to create the little fur strokes, and also to blend all of the colors in together. And this is where you can add in lots of little tones, add in those tiny little bits of highlights, those little shadows in the shadows, getting in all those little light reflections, and everything that brings it to life and adds those final little details. Also doing a bit of shading down underneath on his chest. It's mostly in shadow, but I am blending that out into the rest of the fur that is catching the light, and adding in those little fur texture strokes as well, so that he looks like my fluffy little boy. I'm also adding in a little bit of detail to his muzzle as to where his whiskers are going to go, and that was a little difficult. I was using some small brushes, and it was kind of hard to get the little specks so that they looked right. So I blended it out and decided I would wait and do that a little bit later. And so I moved on to the ears. It's totally okay to do that if you're struggling with a spot and things aren't working the way that you want to. You can cover it up and come back to it later, especially because these are thick, heavy acrylics with a lot of pigment load. You can really easily cover things up like that. I also go in for some fine little details on the ears and the muzzle, and really trying to get that highlight that catches the ear, and a little bit of the fluff on the inside of the ear as well. For all these little details, I'm using this little angled detail brush. It's awesome, but I seem to have lost it, so I have to go on a hunt for that. But this was the last time that I saw it. And then going in back with that angled shader to add in some more details. One thing I'm also doing is taking that yellow color and going back in around the places that I've already painted to cut into certain places. This does two things. First of all, it helps me clean up the outline and the border. And second of all, it creates this push and pull between the background and the foreground, because parts of the background will be physically laying over the foreground, yet it's the background. So your mind visually pushes and pulls it, and it creates a really interesting effect that I'm a big fan of. So it's something that you can consider. The way in which you layer up your paint can have an effect beyond what color and what your eye may actually know, especially when you're working with textured paints like this. That texture, that thickness, the layering is all a lot more visible. So it's something that you can use very intentionally, and that's one of the ways that you can do it. Adding in some more highlights to his eyes and blending out his little pupils and adding in some of those like final little like white highlights. And then I finally move on to the bigger leaves down in the front and the flowers. So I did mention earlier that we were going to be using a palette knife, and that's because I definitely thought that I did this with a palette knife, but I'm now remembering that I was really struggling with palette knife flowers, so I decided to use thick brush strokes instead. So I started by adding in the highlights using these thick, curved, kind of wobbly lines. And I'm going to start basically by establishing the highlights and then establishing the shadows, and then I can go in and blend and add more detail from there. This makes it easier for me to see where all of the petals are and to keep track of the overall like shape of the flowers. So as you can see, I'm working in steps. I'm blocking in that shading kind of how I did at the start of painting Muse, and then I am going in and I will add more detail and blend things out. So blocking in where those highlights are, and then adding shading within the highlights and highlights within the shading, going in and adding those little lines to indicate where the little veins are, and just building them up, but while also keeping it somewhat impressionistic, because these are texture paints, I do really want to create more of a impressionistic textured feel. I feel like I've said textured 100,000 times in this video. So someone count it and let me know how many times I said the word textured. I would be very curious. Really pushing in the darks on this and then going in with those darks on those flowers. As you can see, I'm adding them right at the edge of that highlight and then blending it up into the highlight above it. And that kind of gives the impression of petals. That's kind of the technique I've been using recently for painting roses, and it seems to be working pretty well. And I also add in some little lines to add in more texture and more detail. You can kind of see if you look at a petal, it has these kind of little indentations in it that you can kind of create and represent with these little lines. Also adding in some more highlights and just building everything up. Right now, the roses are looking kind of flat. They're not looking as three-dimensional as they could. They're just kind of flat, but with layers of those petals. What we're going to do is when that dries, we're going to actually go over it with a little bit of glazing. One thing that I talked about towards the beginning of this video is how they have these paints have a really high pigment load, so that allows them to be thinned with water. So that allows you to do glazing techniques on top of things like this, and glazing techniques on top of textured paint is also, there it is again, on top of thick paint is very interesting because it kind of sinks into certain areas that have less paint in them, and it just creates a really interesting texture. So that's something else that you can play around with, different ways to use paints that are thicker and have more of a heavy body. There's different techniques that you can try that will affect those paints differently. So they're really fun little techniques to try, and that's another one that hopefully inspires you, and we'll see me do that in just a few moments once I finally finish getting the petals exactly the way I want them. Don't be afraid to take your time to add the detail in these. Even though we're going for more of an impressionistic look, we still want to take time to add detail. It's just the way that we add that detail. Instead of going in and blending it really, really neatly, I'm relying on different methods of blending and layering colors next to each other instead of this soft kind of smoky, smudgy blending that I might use with a thinner acrylic. Also adding in a little bit of a hint of where the stem would be, keeping it very dark and in the shadows. And then once it's dry, we're going over with that glazing technique that I talked about to add more shadows and more three-dimensionality to these roses. And that's going to make them look a lot more like they're part of the piece versus just sitting on top of the piece. After doing this and kind of adding in all my shadows, I am pretty close to being done with this, just adding in those final little details. And this is probably one of my favorite pieces I've done in this series. I might be biased because it is a painting of my cat, so there is that, but I do love how it turned out. I love working with texture paint, and I love how this looked at the end. I hope this video was helpful and informative to you, taught you something about working with heavy body acrylics, and taught you a little bit more about the Daler-Rowney one specifically. And I hope that you liked my painting of my baby cat Muse. I love him so much, and I love you guys so much. So thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye!